In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. This is our fourth session of the class we've entitled Our Struggle, the struggle against ecumenism by the true Orthodox in the 20th and 21st centuries. Tonight we're going to conclude this article by Bishop, then Hieromonk Maximus, called Why the True Orthodox Are Truly Orthodox. And part 4 tonight is about the Church of the Old Calendar. Are the true Orthodox Christians? Who are they? Okay. Of course, we're speaking now of the Church of Greece. There are true Orthodox groups in almost every national church now, but we're speaking specifically of the Orthodox Church of Greece and the ones who are called the Old Calendarists. Although their name for themselves, our name for ourselves, is the Church of the Genuine Orthodox Christians. We hear the acronym GOCH. That's from Greek Gamma, Omicron, Chi, Genesione Orthodoxon Christianon, of the genuine Orthodox Christians. When the Gregorian calendar was introduced in Greece in 1924, over 1 million of the faithful refused to accept it, choosing rather to sever communion with the schismatic hierarchy. Although a significant number of bishops were sympathetic to the old calendarists, for the change of the calendar had occurred not because of popular demand, but due to pressure from the Greek government, which was seeking to modernize and liberalize the church. It was not until 1935 that 3 bishops officially renounced the new calendar church and assumed leadership of the true Orthodox. So from 1924 to 1935, the old calendarists were led chiefly by hieromonks from Mount Athos and other of the lower clergy, mostly monastic clergy, who would not accept the change. The new calendarists responded by deposing the 3 bishops, of course, and launching a vicious persecution against the Orthodox. With the assistance of the police, they broke up church services. We have photographs of this and abundant testimonies to this. They broke up church services, overturned the chalice, and they would overturn the chalice and stamp on the holy gifts. They would trample the Eucharist into the dust, imprison and forcibly shave the priests and monks, brutalized the faithful. Several were killed. One that we've canonized as a martyr is St. Catherine Rutis, who was killed by a blow to the head for police rifle butt because she went to shield. He was about to brain her priest, and she jumped in as a shield, and the policeman crushed her head with the rifle butt. She was a young mother. Imprisoned and forcibly shaved priests and monks, brutalized the faithful, several were killed, and denied them basic civil rights, such as the right to marry and to attend college. And that sounds odd to us, right, living in a civil, secular society. But in Greece at this time, back in the 1920s and 30s, and really up until recently, if you to marry legally and to inherit property and so forth, you had to be a baptized Orthodox Christian and show a baptismal certificate and a marriage certificate approved by the state church in order to have ordinary participation, in order to, for example, to go to university. That's why they made it illegal for our people to go to the university. Then they turned around and told us that we were uneducated. But you're a bunch of uneducated people. None of you went to college. Well, you didn't let us go to college. That was changed, I think, by the 1970s. Actually, our previous Archbishop Chrysostomos Kousis of Blessed Memory, actually, who had legal training as well, actually won a Greek Supreme Court case, I believe in the 1960s, to overturn some of these restrictions on our people being able to transact ordinary legal business and to attend the universities. Our previous Metropolitan Pavlos, I know, did attend the University of Thessalonica in the 1970s, early 1980s. So it was by that time we were able to go to the universities. Unfortunately, several small but vocal groups broke away from the main synod of the true Orthodox, giving rise to the myth popular among the new calendarists that the Greek Old Calendarists are split into innumerable squabbling jurisdictions. This notion is misleading, however, for the great majority. About 70% of the true Orthodox in Greece remains in the original synod. That's 70% when Father Maximus wrote this years ago. It's now more like 90% are in our synod. So the other groups are dwindling, they're very small. And some have some have a better argument for their canonical status than others, but ours clearly has the best canonical argument for being the continuation of the State Church of Greece, of the truly Orthodox National Church of Greece. The true Orthodox have remained faithful not only to the Church's calendar, but also to the patristic mindset and spirituality. The old calendars cultivate the piety, always characteristic of the Church, but mostly abandoned by the ecumenists, keeping the fasts, reading the Fathers, saying daily prayers, holding full vigils. When the Greeks say full vigils, they mean really all night. We in the Russian practice, we call the service on Saturday night or Feast day nights, that's 2 hours, we call that the all-night vigil, but actually in Greek parish usage, usually there's just Vespers on Saturday night or even feast, but when they have an all-night vigil, they call it agritnia, and they'll really stay up all night. That, of course, that was more common in the past than it is now, but it was, up until recently, it was quite common. Parish churches would have frequent all-night services. Practicing the hesychastic tradition of interior prayer and watching of the mind, monasticism is very strong, and this is natural because monasteries have always been bastions of orthodoxy, the first to resist heresy whenever it appeared in the past. Indeed, it is usually the case that the most impious element within the Church introduces a heresy. That's what you would expect. And the most pious portion rejects the innovation. This tendency is proven true in the current situation, for the hierarchs who introduced ecumenism and changed the Church's calendar were secularists, modernists, and westernizers, while the faithful who resisted the changes were the monks and those who cleaved to the Orthodox phronema. Such is the case even today. A difference not only of belief but of piety and mindset separates the new calendarist from the old calendarist. Of course, within the State Church of Greece and the Ecumenical Patriarchate, there's a tiny minority, a fragment, who follow Athonite elders who insist that they stay somehow under the Ecumenical Patriarchate. That's a whole story of itself. But our Metropolitan Demetrius actually has a good video on this, because people will say, well, we heard, for example, the Elder Joseph, so-called Elder Joseph Hesychast, who was the spiritual father of the now deceased Ephraim of Arizona, say, well, they became commemorators. They left the non-commemorators and became commemorators back in 1950 this or 60 that. And our Metropolitan has a very good video talking about all these people, where they came from, where in other words, among the new calendarists or the innovators, having some of these elders is spectacular to them. It's just spectacular. That's amazing. Father Paisius, Father Ephraim, they're amazing. They're spectacular. For the old calendarists, it's like, well, that's old hat. We have dozens of people like that, but we don't market them. We don't go, oh well. We don't have the wow effect about them because we expect that's what we expect. You see, and we actually have a lot of these clairvoyant and extremely holy elders within the non-commemorators, the zealots, the old calendars, but we don't have a good storefront. See, so one of the projects that is dear to our Metropolitan's heart is to write hagiographies of like our Father. Of course, our parish saint, Father Hieronymus, is one of these really outstanding figures. Then there's St. John the new almsgiver, who was canonized by our church a few years ago, who was a hieromonk but a parish priest, and who actually at one point raised a dead child from the dead. And it was Father John. There's a story in the life of Saint Hieronymus. We've all read the book, right? So you remember there's an incident where spiritual children bring a priest to visit him, and the priest wants to go to confession. And St. Hieronymus says, no, I don't want to hear your confession. Go away. I can't hear your confession. Go away. And the little priest goes away. He says, why won't you hear my confession? And that little priest was Father John the almsgiver, Father John the Merciful. And later, the spiritual children said, well, Elder, why didn't you hear the priest's confession? He said, my child, when he walked in, his face was shining like the sun. It was so bright I couldn't look at him. How could I hear his confession? So it's one saint recognizing another saint, you see. We have a lot of people like this, but we don't advertise them, you see. And so that's why there might be a mistaken idea that look, the State Church, the Ecumenical Patriarchate, they must be right because they have this great elder, Paisius, great elder. But these are exceptions to the rule, whereas in our church, these kinds of men are actually almost taken for granted. And because, as Father is saying in the article, the ethos is so strong. You see, now that's hard to experience here in America, where we're so scattered apart. We're so distant. We're not here in the Midwest. We're not close to a monastery, for example. But you can see in our present metropolitan's efforts at St. John in Cobleskill, you can see he has making a very strong effort to benefit from the example and by the prayers of our zealot elders, and to bring this ethos and this phronema to America. It's just too bad. We're such a big country. It's just hard to keep everybody together, and to experience for all of us to experience all these things. Okay, assertion 11. Okay, so he's going to another assertion by Father Basil in that article that we've been our author is responding to. The fact that the old calendarists are split into several groups proves that they are schismatic, and they have a schismatic mentality. In particular, they misinterpret the 31st Apostolic Canon, which permits separating from a bishop for reasons of piety and justice. Remember, that's the very first canon we covered in our first class. Okay. By interpreting this phrase in the broadest way possible, they allow a schism to take place for virtually no reason, or virtually any reason. So that objection has a lot of surface validity, right? It's saying, well, people, you old Calvinists are nuts. You're splitting up. You're fighting, as if they don't, right? But Father Maximus, Bishop Maximus, is a good response. He said the fact that division exists does not in itself signify anything beyond the weakness of fallen human nature. The existence of many religions in the world does not mean that belief in God is false, that atheism is true. In actuality, one religion is true and the others are false. The existence of many churches calling themselves Christian does not mean that Christianity is false, for one Christian church is true and the others are false. By the same token, the plurality of Old Calendar synods does not mean that the Old Calendar as a whole is schismatic, rather that one synod is the historical and authentic one, while the others have separated themselves from it. And when Bishop Maximus wrote this article, there were more of these groups. There are fewer of them now. And there are fewer faithful outside our synod. Furthermore, the new calendarists and ecumenists themselves are hardly free from internal divisions. And when he wrote this, it wasn't nearly as bad as it is now. Now the whole world is divided between pro-Moscow and pro-Constantinople, and they're fighting over turf. When they fight, they always fight over turf. They're never fighting over theology. They're never fighting over witnessing to the faith. It's always over territory and power. Who owns what? Who's in charge where? The Ukrainian church has fragmented into 3 major and many minor groups, and that's true. The Ukrainian church, from the time of the revolution, the Ukrainian church has had more jurisdictions than the Greek old calendarists, and usually not over matters of faith. Usually over matters of infighting among the hierarchs who want to be the boss, or what brand of Ukrainian nationalism they did or did not subscribe to. How fanatically nationalist they were, or how anti-Russian or pro-Russian they were.
And so that's still working itself out.
It's a disaster. It's chaos. Mm-hmm. The Ukrainian situation is subject of. That's too big a subject for right now, but it's worthy of an ocean of tears. The Ukrainian church is fragmented. The Church of Macedonia has declared itself autocephalous and is shunned by the other patriarchates. Now that's as of the writing of this article. Mm-hmm. Now the Macedonian church has been recognized by Constantinople and Serbia. Mm-hmm. So they were actually when they
What about the Greek Archdiocese?
The ecumenical patriarchates. The Greek Archdiocese is under the ecumenical patriarchate.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But see, the ecumenical patriarchate won't call them the Church of Macedonia. The ecumenical patriarchate calls them the Archbishopric of Ohrid, because that's the name of an ancient church under Constantinople. Mm-hmm. You see, and whereas Serbia kind of holds their nose and calls them the Church of Macedonia, even though the Serbs really want them. The Serbs really want to dominate it. But our poor Macedonian friends. I mean, I'm not going to pass judgment on the whole Macedonian situation. It's another situation worthy of tears. But our poor Macedonian friends say that the how do they say it? The Greeks don't want us to have our own country. The Bulgarians won't let us have our own nation, and our own language. And the Serbs won't let us have our own church. Historically, they never had their own church. Well, their own church, quote unquote, is the Archbishop of Ohrid in Byzantine times. But yeah, that's not the subject. So anyway, it's a canonical, kind of a silly canonical situation. Just another silly situation. The churches of Bulgaria and Montenegro have spawned independent counter-churches. The Patriarch of Jerusalem has two patriarchs. That's until recently. They had Theophilus and Irenaeus. Irenaeus has passed away. A bewildering array of vagante groups exist, claiming apostolic succession from one or another in official churches. That's especially in Latin America. In Latin America, you can find like 50 jurisdictions, and most of them don't claim to be old counters. They claim to be from the ecumenical patriarch, usually from a Greek origin.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So are there a lot of Greek immigrants in Latin America?
Not so much. It's more often a Latin American clergyman who's stolen ordination, so to speak, from some renegade Greek bishop. It's a mess. Latin America is, if you think the jurisdictional situation in the United States is bad, you should go to Latin America. It's just, it's absurd. It's totally ridiculous, right? And most of them, they claim their apostolic succession from quote unquote world orthodoxy, and it's not, they're not separate because of ecumenism. They're separate because of ecclesiastical entrepreneurship. Okay? And also the Latin American mentality, which is they want different degrees of mixing it with superstition and Catholicism and so forth. Okay. In addition, the official patriarchates are often very hostile to one another. And the Patriarchate of Constantinople in particular has a tendency to carve out and support uncanonical autonomous churches within the historical territory of the other patriarchates, especially Moscow. That's gone on. Archbishop St. John Maximovich has an article, a speech, an article on the criminal behavior of the ecumenical patriarchate up to his time. He proposed 1966. And he wasn't talking about just ecumenism. He was talking about also that they created this Church of Czechoslovakia. They created this Church of Poland. They've created this Church of Estonia, and all this. This is just pure imperialism. It's pure ecclesiastical imperialism. Yeah, and these churches they create usually are very modernist, and not because they're making these things in their own image. As I pointed out in an earlier class, they only granted Romania their own patriarchate when Romania agreed to be on the new calendar. The new calendar was a condition. And the first patriarch was actually a uniate. Patriarch Miron was a uniate. Okay.
When did that happen?
1924.
24.
Yeah. So it was Greece and Romania. Greece, Constantinople, and Romania were the first three to go new calendar.
Mm-hmm. And this history of the old calendar's church, 1 million of the faithful, finally 3 bishops came over them in the 30s. This is all the history of the Greek Old Calendar Church.
Strictly the Greek Old Calendar Church.
But the Romanian Old Calendar Church has had its own history.
Its own history, and
yes,
and the Russian Church abroad and the Catacomb Church in Russia is a parallel but quite distinct story.
Yes.
That they intersect. These groups kind of intersect with each other and then come apart and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a complicated story.
Yes.
But right now we're focusing. I'm mainly going through this article for 2 reasons. One is that our parish is in the Goch, so this is our historical lineage. This is our heritage as a parish. And the second reason is that it presents, whether we're talking about the Greek situation or Romanian or Russian or whatever national situation, it presents a cogent argument for breaking communion with a heretical bishop prior to conciliar condemnation, which is the crux of the problem that we're faced with, or the challenge that's flung to us by what the so-called conservative world Orthodox, who say yes, our bishops are heretical, they are in apostate ecumenism, but we must stay with them because there's not been a synodical condemnation by an ecumenical council. And so this article I posed was one of the better, more articulate but simple explanations of why their position is not historical, and why our position does have historical, patristic, and canonical foundation. Okay.
Father, you just mentioned about Romanian Church when you said once they got their patriarch, they got on the new calendar, and it just made me think about since I saw the Ukrainian Church and they said fragmented to 3 major groups, but one of these major groups, I would assume, it's the one who recent years got independence from Constantinople Church as well. And they're also changing to the new calendar now.
Well, there have been two phases of Constantinople's intrusion in Ukraine. One's a very much older phase. There's been a Constantinopolitan Ukrainian church for decades, going back to the era of Ukrainian separatism after the revolution. But there's this new fake church Bartholomew set up that's pro-new calendar, pro-LGBT, pro-communion with the Catholics, and so forth. That's going full speed ahead with the Bartholomew program. In a way, Bartholomew's his creation in the Ukraine, those people, they're freer to pursue Bartholomew's agenda than his Greek people are, because the Greeks, there are enough conservative Greeks left in the Constantinopolitan Church to sort of put the brakes on some of the worst abuses. But in Ukraine, those people have no immune system; they're helpless, they're prostrate. And so he can really pursue his agenda there, and he's because his sponsors, the Western power structure, are so invested in advancing the rainbow ideology and abortion rights and pornography and all that stuff, and the breakup of the family and the whole open society agenda. And Bartholomew, of course, is totally on board with this, and so that unfortunate little Ukrainian church under Bartholomew is going to be like the poster boy for future what the deep state wants to do gradually with all the Orthodox victim states, all the Orthodox countries. Okay. It is true that let's go on to this. Let's go back to Father Basil's objection about what he claims is our too free use of the 31st Apostolic Canon. It is true that the 31st Apostolic Canon may be interpreted in such a way as to permit a schism for virtually any reason, of course, if you misuse it, obviously. Right. However, at the very least, the canon allows for separation on the basis of heresy. If it did not, the clause for reasons of piety and justice would have no meaning at all, because heresy is the most obvious reason, right, to separate. And it is for reasons of heresy that the old calendars are separated from the new calendars, not because they weren't pious, not because they didn't wear robes, not because we think we're better, which we're not, in many ways we're not, but specifically because of a heresy. If a small group has left the historical Old Calendar Church using the canon as justification, it in no way discredits the Old Calendars as a whole, but only those individuals who misapplied the canon. Okay. In the Russian Church, we have a parallel situation where it's not this canon, but the schisms in the Russian Church, the confessing non-MP Russian Church, have been created on the basis of the famous ukaz of Patriarch Tikhon of 720 November 1920, which said that the Patriarch knew, of course, his activities were already very constrained by the communist government, and he knew that ordinary communications or even authentic communication between Moscow and the outlying parts of Russia, much less the immigration, would be impossible. So by this ukaz, I think it was ukaz 362, I think was the number, of 1920, he authorized bishops that could not really communicate with the central church authority, which at that time meant almost everybody, because the Soviets were controlling everything, to set up temporary church administrations. But now, the recent difficulty is that to this day now, after the unfortunate capitulation of most of Roe Court to the Moscow Patriarchate in 2007, the different true Orthodox groups who have split with each other, and the one who leads the split will usually cite Ukaz 362 of 720 November 1920. See, so the great debate is, how does that really apply now to our situation? But we'll have to save that discussion for our when we do the Russian side of this whole history. Okay. So in other words, you can misuse a canon, or you can misuse a conciliar or a patriarchal decision, right? So that there are schismatic-minded or sectarian-minded people within Old Calendar Church, there's no doubt of that. And as I've told our parishioners before, I said, we know we're Orthodox. We've confessed our faith. We're not with the communists. Our danger is just being weird, right? Or developing a sectarian mindset, developing anti-Catholic, in the good sense, of course, anti-small c Catholic, not having sobornos, not having the desire to be part of the universal church, but just being content with being some little offbeat group. And that's not we didn't separate from the patriarchate in order to leave the church, but to stay in the church, right? To be in the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, not to be an elite group. And they're part of the different sectarian ideologies that have arisen within Old Calendarism do involve some kind of elitism. Like you were asking me about Cyprianism, for example. Part of the heresy of Cyprianism is that the true Orthodox are an elite cadre within world Orthodoxy. You see, which is ridiculous on two counts. One is that there is no such thing. And self-evidently, there can't be an elite cadre within the church. That sounds like Freemasonry, right? And the other is that the people that were claiming this were themselves not very elite. They're not an elite cadre. Regard themselves as the spiritual elite. So the old calendarists do not regard themselves as the spiritual elite of Orthodoxy. When I joined the Russian Church Abroad in 1985, the higher monk who brought me into the Russian Church Abroad, he was very abrupt. He said, listen, he said, the Russian Church Abroad is not the cream that's floated to the top of Orthodoxy after all these years. He said, we're hanging on to Orthodoxy by our fingernails. That's right. So if we are the authentic Orthodox, right, then we should have the discernment, the diocracies, the discernment to realize that we're just barely hanging on to Orthodoxy, right? It's the Orthodoxy of the latter days. It's the Orthodoxy of the humble, of those who really aren't doing great works or aren't very visible, but are just striving to remain in the church through our confession of faith and through striving for unity as best we can. But unity is so difficult in our current circumstances, right? Outward unity is so difficult. There's so many things are militating against it. Okay, so Father Basil's his charge that we have a schismatic mentality that's only it can be applied to some people, but it can be applied to a lot of people in world Orthodoxy. Schismatic mentality. So it's not really a serious accusation. Assertion 12 by Father Basil. Okay, and this is really wild. The main body of old calendarists was left without bishops in 1955. This shows they were abandoned by God. Of course, Father Maximus is going about how hypocritical does it get? Yes, we were left without bishops because you arrested them all. You were abandoned by God because God enabled us to arrest your bishops and imprison them so they couldn't meet to consecrate new bishops. So that shows you were abandoned by God. It's pretty bad.
Sounds similar to what's happened in Russia.
In Russia, right?
1920s,
right, 1920s, yeah.
All the priests and everybody got arrested.
Got arrested. So, well, look, you're abandoned by God, but we were in prison and we couldn't consecrate new bishops. Right? Okay, reply by Father Maximus. We were brought to this impasse by the violent and bloody persecution of the new calendarists. Okay, so there were two big eras of persecution. Okay, there were the 20s and 30s. Then in the 40s, World War II and the Greek Civil War interrupted this. Everybody had these other problems to worry about. The German occupation of Greece, then the terrible civil war between the communists and the royalists that broke out at the end of the war. So for that decade of the 40s, there was no persecution, or very little persecution of the old calendarists by the state church, because the Greeks were just trying to survive. And it was a question whether Greece would emerge from the Civil War as a royalist Orthodox state or as a communist country. Okay. But in the 1950s, there was this Archbishop Spiridon of the state church who really violently, viciously persecuted the new calendarists. The old calendarists. So there was a new resurgence of persecution in the 50s by Archbishop Spiridon of the state church. We were brought to this impasse by the violent and bloody persecution of the new calendarists, who used force to coerce the weaker bishops of our church into joining the schismatic new calendar church. So some bishops were coerced into joining the new calendar, others were imprisoned. For example, Germanos of the Kyklades, who was actually the spiritual father of the people who founded St. Spiridon Church in Detroit, was imprisoned for a while. And of course, the most famous example is Chrysostomos of Florina. Eventually, Bishop Chrysostomos of Florina was left as our sole bishop, and when he died in 1955, we remained without hierarchs. That's true. Our church is not the first local church to suffer this misfortune. There have been many cases in history where the church has literally been persecuted out of existence. For example, the once flourishing church of North Africa was conquered by the Muslims, who launched such a heavy persecution that there is today not a single Orthodox Christian left, where once there were millions. Far from discrediting the old calendarists, this unfortunate situation rather discredits the new calendarists who resorted to violence in order to establish their innovation. It's because of them that we were left without bishops. We should note also that the fact that the Greek old calendarists were without bishops for 5 years did not mean they ceased to be a legitimate local church. During the 16th century, all the bishops in Little Russia, any Ukrainian nationalists, I'm sorry, I know that'll offend you, but we say Little Russia, we say Malaya Rossiya sometimes, right? Little Russia. During the 16th century, all the bishops in Little Russia became uniates, right? And the faithful were left without hierarchs, but orthodoxy did not cease to exist. Right? Likewise, in the life of St. Maximus the Confessor, we read that the Monothelites asked the saint, "To which church do you belong? Byzantium, Rome, Antioch, Alexandria, or Jerusalem?" All these churches and the provinces under them were in concord. If you belong to the Catholic Church, you must enter into communion with us at once, lest you forge a new and strange pathway, and fall into unexpected disaster. So they're saying, that's the argument people use today. If you don't belong to one of the patriarchates, you're not in the church. The man of God wisely replied, Christ the Lord, excuse me, Christ the Lord acknowledges as Catholic that church which maintains the true and saving confession of faith. But tell me, on what basis have all these churches, as you say, entered into communion? That is, on the foundation of truth. I do not wish to be separated from them. Excuse me. When a saint was told it was not on the foundation of truth, but on an agreement in heresy, that the patriarchs were united, they all agreed to sign this typos of the emperor. So they're being united on the basis of their rejection of truth, united in heresy. He refused to have communion with them, even if it meant that he would be left under no bishop at all. On another occasion, and asked a similar question, he replied, "The whole world may enter into communion with the patriarch, but I will not." The Apostle Paul tells us that the Holy Spirit anathematizes even angels who preach a new gospel, that is, introduce a novel teaching. By the way, our St. Chrysostom of Florina said something similar in a letter that he wrote. I believe it was a letter to his former deacon, Patriarch Athenagoras, who was inviting him. He said, we'll let you keep your old calendar, just join us.
The big tent.
And he said, everybody's joined us. You're going to be left all alone. And he wrote back and said, if there was only one old calendarist left in the world, I would be that one. I'd be that one. And this is not a man, because Chrysostom of Florina is the last man to be accused of a sectarian mentality. His pen name, when he wrote articles for the press or for publication, his pen name was Ecclesiastikos, churchman. A man with a profound. He had been the archdeacon of the Patriarchate of Constantinople, like the man next to the patriarch. Okay, he was the most prominent, most eminent churchman in Greece. There's no way you could accuse Chrysostom of Florina of having a sectarian mentality. He embodied churchliness, what the Russians called cerkovnost. And he's the one who said, if there's only one old calendarist left in the world, I'm going to be the one. Okay. The old calendar church, emulating the confessing spirit of St. Maximus, found itself for a short period in a position similar to his. But God blessed our church for its perseverance in adversity, with the result that the Russian church abroad ordained bishops for us and formally recognized our church as canonical. The ordinations took place in the early 60s. Bishops that were involved were Seraphim of Chicago, Seraphim of Caracas, Leonti of Chile, and one Romanian bishop, Theophilos, because at that time there were some Romanians in the Russian Church of Rome. One accusation against the original ordination of Akakios Papas, which had happened here in Detroit at St. Nicholas Church on 8 Mile Road in Detroit, was that Theophilus Ionescu served in the new calendar. But this is a period in the history of the Russian Church abroad in the 1950s, when there was a strong non-patriarchal Romanian group that was very anti-communist. And they would not submit to the Patriarchate because they knew the Patriarchate was under the control of the Romanian security services. Very much like the Surgeonist or MP Church in Russia. The Russian Church abroad bishops recognized these men as having a lot in common with them, right? They were anti-communist. At that time, even though they were on the new calendar, the Romanians are extremely pious, or extremely traditional in almost all their church life, right? As the state church of Greece was, really, until recently. And so the Russian Church abroad basically said, we'll, out of brotherly love, we'll take you in, but you can't stay in the new calendar indefinitely. Okay? So it was this period, there was kind of a little transitional period, but it didn't turn out to be transitional because they wanted to keep their new calendar, and they just ended up joining the North American Metropolia, who let them keep their new calendar, and they were just more liberal. And that's why there's now Romanian OCA, the Romanians in the OCA. But at this time, Teofilo Ionescu was with the Russian Church abroad, and he, with Seraphim of Chicago, ordained Akakios Papas, the first ordination. And then Leonti of Chile and Seraphim of Caracas went with and ordained other bishops, went with the Greek bishops and ordained other bishops for our synod. But the important point is that in 1969, a few years later, not decades later, a few years later, 1969, under the presidency of Metropolitan St. Philaret, the Russian Church abroad recognized all the ordinations and expressed their desire to be in communion with the Goch, with the Greek Old Calendar Church. It's a famous letter. We have copies of it. We have the physical copies of it in our synod office, and we published virtual copies all over the internet, so anybody can see this and everybody can see the signatures on it. Also, I think I pointed out in an earlier talk that St. John Maximovich was in favor of the ordinations. He did not participate in the ordinations. He was afraid of Metropolitan Anastasi, who was not in favor of the ordinations at that time. But as I said, our friend Anastasius Hudson, in researching the life of Metropolitan Petros, found the minutes. The minutes were being kept by John Maximovich because he was the secretary at the time. And he's on record as supporting the ordinations. And the fact that then he would subsequently, after Metropolitan Petros was ordained, that he would go to St. Marcellus, our cathedral in New York, and pray with them. They'd greet him as a bishop. He would take photographs with them and show that he supported our church. Okay. He couldn't, still at that point in the early 1960s, he couldn't serve with our bishops because the Synod had not formally recognized the ordinations. But in 1969, they were definitely recognized. Okay. Assertion 13. Okay, he's coming to this whole era of the ordinations. This is the assertion 13 by Father Basil, our critic. The main body of Old Calendarists regained its episcopacy in 1960 from the Russian Church abroad, which at that time was in full communion with the New Calendar churches. Right? Remember, the Russian Church abroad did not de-recognize, except for Moscow. Okay, the Russian Church abroad only formally was not in communion with the Moscow Patriarchate, the North American Metropolia, and the Evlogian Schism in Paris, because these were schisms in the Russian Church, so that naturally they weren't in communion with the schisms in the Russian Church, right? But the Russian Church abroad never formally broke communion with the other patriarchates or the other autocephalous or autonomous churches. Rather, these other churches abandoned the Russian Church abroad, although at one time they all recognized the Church abroad as a legitimate hierarchy, under pressure from somewhere. They, one by one, well, basically because the Russian Church abroad wouldn't join ecumenism. And also perhaps because of Soviet infiltration, or who knows what reason. But one by one, the patriarchates abandoned the Russian Church abroad. They kicked her out, basically, of the family of churches. Wouldn't recognize her. But actually, that was a badge of honor, right? Because they kicked her out because she was telling the truth, and she was standing for the truth. Okay. So formally, the Russian Church abroad was still, at least formally, if not very often practically, formally the Russian Church abroad was still in communion with the Ecumenical Patriarchate, and the State Church of Greece at this time, which is why Metropolitan Anastasi, who was a very old man, he's in his 90s, right? He was living in the past. He still thought of the ecumenical patriarchate as something, the way he thought of it when he was a young man, right? But the State Church of Greece, he probably couldn't wrap his mind around how bad they had become, or how bad ecumenism had become. Okay. So in the early 60s, it is true the Russian Church abroad was in communion with the ecumenical patriarchate and the State Church of Greece. So Father Basil goes on. The old calendars contradict themselves, saying on the one hand the new calendar church is heretical, while on the other hand accepting ordination from a church in communion with the same heretics. The old calendars are guilty of using the ends to justify the means. Reply. When a church falls into heresy or schism, it does not automatically follow that all the correctly believing churches in communion with the erring church are instantly cut off from the church. The Russian Church abroad in 1924. That is the Matthewite theory. The Matthewites, of course, are one of the splits in the Greek Old Calendar Church. Their theory is that in 1924, as soon as the calendar was changed, every church in the world that remained in communion with the State Church of Greece, the switch was flipped, the lights went out, no grace. Boom, boom at that point, no grace anywhere in the whole world except with the Greek Old Calendars, or those who had broken with the new calendars. Okay. That's the Matthewite theory. But as Father Moxos points out, there's a period of time during which a correctly believing church of necessity remains in communion with the heretical or schismatic church, just as there's a period of time during which the faithful of a local church ascertain whether there is a heresy within their own church from which one must separate. So just as within the local church, you don't immediately break with your bishop. You do due diligence. You find out what he's teaching. You see if he's teaching it over a period of time. You find out if the ordinary means for correcting him have been exhausted, and so forth. You go through a lot of steps before breaking communion. Also, on the macro level, a whole local church will wait a while before breaking communion. It's very terrible. I mean, it's a very drastic. It's a nuclear option, right, to break communion. So you don't break communion right away, but you watch for a while. And the events of the 1960s and the failure to respond to Metropolitan Philaret's sorrowful epistles and other reproaches pretty well consolidate the Russian Church abroad's stance that, the World Orthodox are pretty well going out the door. It's a good thing they de-recognized us because we probably shouldn't recognize them. But this hadn't yet happened in the early 60s. If slow communications, lack of interest in church outside affairs, internal problems which occupy the bishop's attention, difficulty of judging events outside of one's immediate sphere of action prevent the members of a local church from immediately breaking communion with their heretical hierarch, then much more so is this the case with respect to the bishops of another autocephalous church, a whole other church. Yeah. Each local church requires a period of time, differing according to circumstance, to ascertain whether another local church has truly fallen into heresy or schism, or is guilty merely of some abuse or misunderstanding. The Russian Church abroad in its earlier years was hardly in a position to analyze the theological implications of ecumenism and the new calendar, given that it was simply trying to survive and reconstruct a normal church life after escaping the communists. It was only after, take the foundation of the World Council of Churches. When is it? 1948. 48. What's going on in 48 in the Russian community? Chaos. Millions of refugees in DP camps in Europe. Okay, it's a miracle. In so many ways, they call Velika Anastasi the Moses of the Russian immigration, because he led all these people out of Europe and got them settled in America and Australia and so forth. And it's quite a story, quite a saga, just on the human level, just the survival of the Russian immigration after World War II is quite a saga. So there's so much going on in the Russian world that they couldn't they weren't really paying attention to how bad ecumenism was in the ecumenical patriarchate of the State Church of Greece. They were still looking for help from people that they believed were their brother Orthodox, even though they were continually wounded by these churches one by one, recognizing Moscow and de-recognizing them. Whereas between the wars, The default position was that the patriarchates recognized the church abroad and did not recognize Moscow. The Russian church abroad in its earlier years was hardly in a position to analyze the theological implications of ecumenism in the new calendar, given that it was simply trying to survive and reconstruct a normal church life after escaping the communists. It was only after several decades that the church abroad had sufficiently stabilized its internal situation to be able to assess the question of ecumenism and the calendar. When it did, it concluded that ecumenism was heretical, thus the 1983 anathema against ecumenism. Right? For this reason, it severed relations with the new calendars and ecumenist churches, entered into full communion with our church, subsequently issued the anathema against ecumenism in 1983. Okay, so that's our author's response to Father Basil's direct attack on our church as a church. Okay. Those are his objections. These are Bishop Mux's response. Conclusion. Father Basil's article, and by extension all the New Calendar polemics which use arguments similar to those found in the article, and Father Basil's article is a summary of all the main objections that they still have. It doesn't really... Father Peter Heers is the new advocate of this position. And then they've added some more salt and pepper by invoking their elders. St. Paisius this and Father Ephraim that and so forth. But basically it's still the same arguments. Okay? They haven't really changed. Father Basil's article, and by extension all the New Calendar polemics, which use arguments similar to those found in his article, fails to provide the patristic support necessary to prove that one should remain in communion with uncondemned heretics. He thus fails to convict the old calendarists of having violated the patristic witness. A close examination of the evidence shows that the stand of the traditionalist Orthodox is entirely vindicated. Heresy is being taught on multiple levels within world Orthodoxy, most significantly on the Episcopal level, of course. And the unanimous consensus of the Fathers is that one must separate communion from those who preach contrary to the traditions we have received from the Apostles. Not only are the conclusions of the conservative New Calendarists like Father Basil, not only are their conclusions wrong, but their whole method of argumentation is wrong. They reject the rule of the church as inconvenient and then search church history and writings of the Fathers where they cherry-pick isolated fragments of history or writings of the Fathers out of context and so forth. To find exceptional cases which can be employed to defend virtually any pet theory. And remember, exceptions make bad law. Right? You don't cherry pick exceptions to then justify a new standard of behavior. And especially don't use it to condemn other people who are following the old standard of behavior. Right? Then they formulate these exceptions into a new rule and vilify those who adhere to what the church has always taught. But what is the established rule of the church? Nothing other than the consensus patrum, the universal voice of the Fathers in concord with one another. Since the truths of Orthodoxy find their ultimate temporal expression in the consensus of the Fathers and the age-old-long tradition of the Church, it should be evident that to formulate new ideas based on exceptions rather than the rule, minority opinions rather than majority, and deviations rather than the norm, is to reject the whole thinking of the Fathers of the Church. In other words, it's an unorthodox mindset, one which has often been employed to justify heresy and is itself a heretical methodology. It's a methodology that lends itself to heresy, that comes from a heretical mindset. Okay. It is no doubt easy to be complacent, overly comfortable with the established structure of the church and conclude that wide-sweeping heretical movements which originate within the church are a thing of the past. Well, that's in the old days. Arianism, all that stuff, that's a long time ago. That doesn't happen anymore. Okay. After all, it has been many centuries since a large group of Orthodox bishops has espoused a new heresy. That's true. And the passage of time can create a sense of security. But there is no reason why heresy cannot arise today and threaten to take over the church, just as in the past the church was nearly overwhelmed by the Arians, Monothelites, and other heretics. The gates of hell cannot prevail against the church, but large portions of her can most certainly fall away, and indeed have. Reluctance to accept this fact, combined perhaps with the inevitable inconveniences which arise from not being part of an institution recognized by the fallen world, it is very inconvenient, can lead sincere and well-meaning persons to a position which ultimately is rejected by the church. But an honest, diligent reading of church history and the works of the Fathers, within the context of fidelity to sacred tradition and a pious way of life, will make clear the Orthodox teaching on every controversy. person who possesses a firm resolve to follow his conscience, even when this involves sacrifices, will inevitably embrace the position held by the traditionalist Orthodox. He will sever communion with those churches teaching heresy and place himself under bishops who confess orthodoxy in her pristine apostolic exactness. Okay, that's the end of the article. Okay. All right, any questions or observations? So basically, he just summarized the article. In the first part, he established the criteria by which one should know to break communion. Right? And in the second part, he went through the calendar controversy and pointed out the calendar has been thoroughly anathematized by the church, and so there's really no wiggle room for accepting the new calendar. In the third part, he talks about ecumenism per se, and the fact that the proclamations of ecumenism by all the major patriarchates have in fact been on an official level and have been repeated over many decades. Then in this fourth part we read tonight is about the objections to aspects of our church and defending our history, right, and our apostolic succession. So it's a very complete article. I think this is a good one you can give friends who ask about, friends who are more informed Orthodox friends who are saying world Orthodoxy. They already sort of know the ground rules. Maybe they're already concerned about ecumenism. They don't know why we're separate, and they've heard arguments like those of this Father Basil or Father Peter hears. And this would be a good article to give them. And you can also play our recordings, which modify or extrapolate from, and then in some cases I've had to update some of the things that Bishop Maximus wrote at that time. The article, what is the date of the article? He was still a Hieromonk. I'll look at the website, it has the date. But it's over 10 years ago. Right, we have a good question about the role of the Greek government in forcing the calendar change and persecuting the old calendarists. So what's the question?
Guys, the question is why? What is a benefit of the government? It has to be something.
Of course. So this is due to the anti-church, anti-ecclesiastical measures, such as the new calendar, such as an agenda to shorten the services or have the priests wear secular clothing, and with the ultimate goal of uniting, of course, with the Vatican and with the Anglicans. This is the result of the agenda of a group called the Venizelites in the Greek government. There's a particular statesman named Venizelos, who was very powerful in Greek politics for years, and he was the leader. He wasn't the only one, but he's the leader of a Masonic secularist party that was anti-traditional and anti-orthodox. So for a while, even before the Civil War of the 40s, in the 20s, we had the Venizelites and the Royalists. The Royalists, as you might imagine, were more conservative and more church-minded, and the Venizelites were more secular-minded. And so it was part of the worldwide strategy of the Masonic elite to destabilize and ultimately de-Christianize Europe. So that was just Greece's sheriff of this worldwide conspiracy for the destruction of Christianity in Europe. And they knew the Orthodox would be a harder nut to crack, that the Catholics and Protestants had undergone centuries of secularization, and the Orthodox were a harder nut to crack. That's why they had to kill 60 million people in Russia. They had to kill millions in Romania to bring this about. In Greece, it was they didn't kill as many people, but they they did a lot of damage. And so it basically it was Freemasonry. Yeah, it's Freemasonry.
Related to that, the treatment, the harassment of the old calendarists,
Yes.
and in terms of the disruption to the actual services.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something that has any sort of historical precedent for how the church handles heretics?
Well, that's a big question. I don't know enough. But I don't think that in the past the church, as a whole, approved of interrupting the services of heretics and actually smashing liturgical items, and much less the elements of the sacraments or reported to be sacraments. It's a long-standing controversy, actually, to what extent the church, assuming it's the true church, and is in the favor of the government, the true church aligned with the government, to what extent the true church should use the coercive power of the government to stamp out heresy. But the St. John Chrysostom, in his commentary on the parable of the wheat and the tares, said the tares are the heretics. And he said, you may not uproot them, but all that means is you may not kill them. So he didn't preclude other coercive means. And we know that, for example, just today I was doing my class on 6th century Italy and St. Benedict with our granddaughters. And part of what led to Theodoric, the Austro-Catholic king of Italy, what led to his paranoia and suspicion of Boethius, the great Boethius, his father-in-law Symmachus, and other Roman senators, was that he was very angry at the Emperor Justin for closing Arian churches, for confiscating the Arians' churches and handing them over to the Orthodox. Theodoric said, well, look, here in Italy, I've let your Orthodox churches stay open. I haven't done anything to them. And now in Constantinople, you're persecuting my Arian co-religionists. And that was the church, the Orthodox Church, using the power of the government to confiscate property. The question is, but does that extend actually to physically harming the heretics? I think in general the consensus of the church is no. But certainly there were laws, there have been laws, I think there are laws in Constantinople where heretics could be tortured, executed, and so forth. But I don't claim to have a definitive answer to that. There is a very instructive episode in the life of Saint Martin of Tours. Saint Martin of Tours lives in the 4th century, and toward the end of he reposes in the last decade of the 4th century, like Saint Ambrose. And he was in Gaul, of course, and there was a local emperor at that time in Gaul, in Spain, and in Britain, the Maximus, who was a sort of a breakaway emperor, but recognized as in those regions as the lawful ruler. And so Rome and Constantinople had not been able to impose their rule there, and they had this kind of rogue emperor, Maximus. But Maximus was very much on board with the severe Orthodox party, which wanted the certain heretics to be, for their villages to be burned down, their property confiscated, and then to be executed. This was the Priscillianists. The Priscillianists, admittedly, were very weird. They were these typical sects with ecstatic prophets and super ascetic rules on the one hand, but licentious behavior on the other hand, the kind of typical pattern with these kinds of people. So they were bad. I mean, St. Martin had no truck with Priscillianism, of course. But he was, St. Martin, his moniker is the Merciful, St. Martin the Merciful, Bishop of Tours. And he was very against the emperor using the military to attack and even kill these people. And so the emperor got fed up with him and said, I've got some of these people under arrest. I think he's in Trèves. I forget. These emperors would move around. They would they were military commanders who moved their camp from one place to another to maintain order. I think at that time the court was in Trèves in Gaul. And these Priscillianists were mostly in Spain. He said, I've got a couple of these of the noblemen that belong to this group under arrest. And if you don't come concelebrate with the rigorist bishops, with my buddies, the rigorist bishops, I'm going to cut their heads off. So he coerced St. Martin into serving with these bishops. And St. Martin didn't want to serve with them because he regarded them as murderers. He regarded them as murderers. And he didn't say it was uncanonical to serve with them. It just troubled him. It troubled him spiritually to serve these bishops. They felt there was blood on their hands because they had incited the emperor to kill the heretics. So St. Martin went, and to save the lives of these men, he concelebrated with the rigorists. And then all these people are Orthodox, right? St. Martin and the ones he didn't want to concelebrate are all Orthodox, but he was spiritually troubled. He didn't want to concelebrate with people that he felt there was blood on their hands. He left. He didn't stay for the banquet or anything after the service. He left immediately with his monks, and he started walking back home. And at one point he said, leave me alone, I'm going off in the woods. He went off in the woods and to pray, and he came back, and they said, well, Father, what's happened here? And he said, an angel spoke with me and said that, and he said, you're right. You had to serve with these men to save the lives of the other. You had to serve with these bishops to save the lives of these men. He said, but it was still a sin. Now, I say, of course, only if you're Orthodox, you can understand that, right? How you'd have to do something like it's a lesser of two evils, but it still leaves a mark on you, right? It still leaves. It doesn't feel right. It still, it damages you. It hurts you, right? And Sulpicius Severus, his biographer, says that for a while after that, Saint Martin couldn't work as many miracles as he used to work. He was a real thaumaturge. He was working miracles constantly. His life was one miracle after another, just constantly working miracles. And after that concelebration, he didn't work as many miracles for a while. He regained the power to work miracles after a while, but he was really so deeply disturbed by having served with these men because he believed there was blood in their hands. You see, so that's not a scientific, theological, or canonical answer, but I think it's an insight into the mind of a saint. Right, how a saint thinks about this. Right? But certainly great fathers, St. Ambrose of Milan, for example, was very zealous, urging the Emperor Theodosius to take the churches away from heretics. And of course, the triumph of Orthodoxy in 381, Second Ecumenical Council, this occurred on because the new Emperor Theodosius was Orthodox, and he took the churches away. All the churches the Arians had seized from the Orthodox, Theodosius grabbed them and gave them back to the Orthodox. See, so remember, in the mind of these people, there's no such thing as this idea of separation of church and state. The church and state are distinct, but they're not separated. There's a symphonia. The question is, how far should the civil authority go in enforcing orthodoxy? I think in general, the best rule is to hold inviolate the lives and property of the heretics, but not to allow them participation in the important sectors of civil society, because they will corrupt. The heretics and the Jews and Muslims and so forth in a Christian state should not be in the military, in the government, in medicine, in education, or control the economy, control banking or finance, right? Because they will inevitably corrupt the life of the nation. But they can function. They can farm. They can be in trades. They can be in merchants, right? And they can have their own society. They have their own worship. But their lives and property should be protected by the state. But they should have a very circumscribed position in the civil society, not be allowed in any positions of influence.